I need to be able to see what I'm doing. All right. Let me get this zoomed in where they'll be able to see. Oh, wrong one. It's the opposite direction. Push the arrow that points right and moves the camera left.
Yeah. It's inverted.
Like, what's going on here? And
That should be a setting I think you can click and change.
I think I have it where it mirrors it so that
Yeah.
like the words aren't backward for those that are online, but we shall see when I get it up and running.
Yeah, it's basically just for you.
Go. All right, so we're starting off chapter 1. I don't know if I told you guys the other day, but this book is it was written a long time ago. So when you guys get to reading it, you're going to see that there are some things that you're like, wow, that's got to have been updated since like 95 or whatever. So there are a lot of things that have been updated, and we will talk about those in class. Okay. Still read the content, obviously. And then I try to make sure that I point out in lecture any areas where like that's not the way it is anymore, or what the current standard is or whatever. Okay. So when we get into that, there will be a little bit more like when we talk about some of the standards and stuff is the majority of the area where we'll have additional updates. But I've also introduced in a couple of examples that are a lot newer, because a lot of the examples that we have are very old, and a lot of the older stuff. Yes, we will still talk about that stuff because it's why we have the rules that we have now. But we'll also talk about some more like current application of some of this stuff as well. Okay. One thing I want to point out that I did not the other day, because I didn't have the book, and I'm going to come over here so that it's where they can see it online. So I don't know what your books currently look like. This is what, because I know they print it, they had to start printing it. This book was out of print. We were printing it on campus for a bit, and then they started. So it looks the same, just black and white, right? Okay, so the thing I want to point out here is that you do have the terms and acronyms. We talked about that when we covered the syllabus. When you do the acronyms, they are over here in the margins of your pages, okay? And there are a few of the acronyms that mean one thing in one chapter and something else in another chapter. So be sure as you're taking those terms and acronyms exams that you're looking at the chapter that we are currently on and look at the acronyms that are over here in the margins for that, okay? For the definitions, the vast majority of them are in the back of the book. But there are quite a few of those that are defined within the text, but they didn't put them in the glossary for whatever reason. Most of the time they put them in a slightly different font within the text. So that will help them kind of stand out a little bit. If you look in the glossary and it's not back there, don't Google search it, because you may get something from some other context. Instead, look through the chapter and try to find the word where it's at within the chapter. Okay. Most of those, as we put them together, we were going through the textbook and putting them as we went. So like if, for example, if you find one word and you're like, it's bold and easy to find in the text, and then the next one you can't find and it's not bolded in the text, but it's one of those that if they put in a slightly different font or something, it should come in order right after that word. So that kind of give you a hint as to where to find it within the text. Okay. So be sure you use your book when you're doing those assignments, okay? So chapter 1, we're talking about hazardous materials management and principles. Industrialization has caused an enormous increase in the use of chemicals, some of which are isolated from nature through mining, extraction, or other methods, and others of which are synthesized to meet particular human needs. So when you went through your science class in high school and things like that, and they talked about like the periodic table, and that's the stuff that comes from nature, right? And then there are so many other things, most of which are made from some combination of that stuff, but they have created so many chemicals since like the dawn of time. Every year they create new things that do new stuff, okay? Science is continually advancing, and especially when it comes to chemicals, use and application thereof. Some of those chemicals are reasonably harmless. Some of those things are like literally stuff they put in your food, And there are other things that even a very small amount could absolutely kill you. So it is extremely important that we understand what we are working with and what the properties of those materials are. So, what are those 3 properties of chemicals that we need to be concerned with? What do you think?
They're chemical, physical, and toxicological properties.
Absolutely. Chemical, physical, and toxicological. And we actually have chapters on each of those. I mean, obviously, we're talking about chemicals this semester, so we're going to be talking about chemical properties. Okay. So when we get into chapter 2, we're going to be mostly talking about the chemical and physical properties, like the basic science concepts related to the chemicals that you may be dealing with in the future. And then chapter 3 is going to cover toxicology of those materials. Now, toxicology is like one of those chemical and physical properties, but it's so much more complex than all those other properties that we'll spend a bit more time on that one in particular, because it's like a completely different world when it comes to the toxicological aspects. Okay, imposing controls on the manufacturing, use, transportation, and disposal of hazardous materials has been regarded as a policing function previously. Okay, it was necessary, but oftentimes it was at odds with what businesses wanted. Okay, before we had regulations, we were already using hazardous materials. And how do you think we got rid of those before we had hazardous material standards saying that we have to appropriately dispose of our hazardous materials? What do you think?
In the river.
Put them in the river?
Put them anywhere that was cheapest.
Put them wherever it's cheapest? Literally bury them in the backyard, dump them out on the ground. Things that today we would be like, oh my God, why would you do that, right? But we didn't know any better before we started learning more about that. Like, literally one of the slogans used to be, dilution is the solution to pollution, right? And now we're like, no, you can't just dilute it down and it's okay. That just spreads it out and makes more of it, right? A hazardous material doesn't just disappear because you add water or dump it in the dirt. It's still there. And so when we started realizing that there were issues, and we started creating regulations to try to protect our environment, protect people from these hazardous materials and such. A lot of businesses were like, well, that's not the way we do things. That costs a lot of money for us to do it that way. And so there was a lot of pushback. So initially, when we first started dealing with the management of hazardous materials, it was very much a policing function. It was forced regulation. Okay. We started doing, the majority of our standards come from late 80s, early 90s, that time frame, and a lot of stuff has been updated some since then. But if you think about it, that's not that long ago, right? And so initially, like all new laws and regulations, there's a whole lot of pushback from industry. We've kind of gotten to the point now where it's not just a kind of regulation and appropriate management of our materials is not just what's expected, but we've kind of gotten to the place where corporations are kind of realizing that there's a lot of money to be saved in managing our materials appropriately. If we can reduce how much we use or how hazardous these materials are, we can recycle them as opposed to just putting them into the environment. We can avoid cleanup from spills and things like that, or avoid spills from ever happening in the first place. There's a lot of money to be saved in managing things responsibly. So that's kind of more of the mindset that we've moved into at this point. One of the reasons why it is so important when it comes to hazardous materials, like I said, there can literally be life and death consequences when it comes to hazardous materials. And not just that, but it can be incredibly expensive, okay? So this example that we're going to talk about here, when you think about huge corporations, they have a big spill, it costs tons of money. What's the most recent big spill you guys can think about that you've heard on the news? Something bad happened. Ohio, the train wreck in Ohio, right? That was just like, what, last year, I think?
Yeah.
I don't know. I always think last year and it's like 10 years ago. Because I'm looking at something. Now, so like last year, there's all these chemicals that were spilled in Ohio. They're still working on like the cleanup and all of that. So we don't have like final numbers. What did it cost and what's the total incredible outcome from that? But we know it was very expensive to clean up. There's issues that they're still fighting with where originally they were saying it's safe, people can be in their homes and all of that stuff, and now they're like, wait, we're sick because of stuff that's in the air here, and no, it's not okay. So I think there'll probably be more coming from that at some point. But a lot of times what you see is that there is a huge impact besides just the cost of we spilled a bunch of chemicals and now we can't use that product, so we've got to pay, we lost all the money for the raw product that we spilled in the first place. We lost the money for all of the emergency services to clean it up. There is much greater impact. With all other things in safety, a lot of times there is not, impact outside of our own business, other than maybe employees, of course. And I'm not saying that that's not important. Obviously, if you impact somebody's life, your impact, you could potentially have impact for generation. But with chemicals, that is expanded to sometimes an entire community. There have been situations in which hazardous material spills have literally not just destroyed a company, but destroyed entire communities. Forever destroyed. They'll never be going back and living there, or it's decades before they do.
What I can think of right there is Flint, Michigan.
Flint, Michigan. Yeah, you still hear about that. And that one isn't like a chemical spill per se, but with Flint, Michigan, you guys know what happened with that?
Wasn't it some sort of radioactivity or something like?
Yeah. Lead in the water.
Lead, okay.
Yeah. So what happened there was that they decided that it would be a great idea if they started using an alternative water source because it would be much cheaper for them to do so. Okay. They didn't do any kind of scientific studies about the water source in which they were choosing to use, but instead they just kind of repop things and started going from a whole new water source. That water source had a particular substance in it, and I don't remember exactly what it was, or I'd give you like the actual name, but it had some substance in it that broke down the old piping that was throughout Flint, Michigan. Okay, so because they had older metal pipes. Okay, I want to say a lot of copper pipes, and they have like a lead soldering that is in those pipes, and it started breaking down that. And so then that lead was getting into the water supply. People are getting lead poisoning from drinking this water. People are getting sick all over town and things like that, right? They not only did that, but they also lied about it and tried to hide it, right? Instead of telling people, oh God, we screwed up, we need to, they tried to justify it, and they did a lot of other terrible things that were all kind of politically based to try to hide it, cover it up, not admit to it, and then try to not have to go back to fix the issue in the first place, right? So there's huge impact for all of those people that were affected by that. You guys will be, if you have not already, I think I have it scheduled for next week or maybe this week. You might not have watched it yet, but you have the video of Bhopal that you're going to be watching. That is still, to this day, one of the biggest industrial disasters that has ever happened in the world. And I know you might be thinking, well, wait, what about Chernobyl and stuff like that, right? There are more people impacted and for generations with Bhopal than with Chernobyl. Chernobyl sounds way scarier if you don't know what that is, that they had a nuclear release decades ago, back in the 80s. Okay. But it was fairly well confined to a fairly small area. And yes, the people in that general vicinity had huge impact, but way more people were impacted from the event that happened with Bhopal. Okay. A lot more immediate deaths and a lot of long-term, forever, and for generations impacts. They are still having, like, people that were exposed at that time had children and grandchildren, and their grandchildren are still experiencing some of the issues because of the genetic issues that it caused from their exposure to those materials. So that's the reason why when we talk about hazardous materials, that this is so incredibly important. For a lot of you, you'll work in companies that have some hazardous materials, but they're not those big, scary, oh my God, into the world kind of scary chemicals. But some of you may find yourself at some point in one of those industries where you're dealing with something that has life and death consequences, or that you're dealing with something that if this were released, It could be a grand scale affect an entire community for generations, okay? So not to say that to scare you off and think like, whoa, this job has way too much responsibility and I don't want it. But just that it's important that you know about the materials you work with and what their potential impact is. This example that I have up here for you is Freedom Industries. This happened in 2014, which feels like it was last year to me, but obviously that's 10 years ago now at this point that this has occurred. In this particular situation, this was a smaller business. They had a chemical leak, and we'll go through some of the stuff here in just a second, a little more detail about it. But when this event occurred, they had 300,000 residents and businesses that were without water during the time period that we're dealing with. It was about a week, maybe a little bit over a week. Cost to the community was approximately $19 million per day. So when we say we have a little bit of a chemical leak, we lost however much material, and now we're having, obviously we no longer have that raw material. We got to pay to clean it up. We don't sometimes think about how it impacts everybody else as well. In this particular situation, $19 million a day is absolutely mind blowing, right? Like, you think of something like oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I can see how that would cost $19 million a day. A little spill in the middle of nowhere, some little town, how can that cost $19 million? Well,
That's still like to this day, like it's still costing them that, or like?
it is not still costing them that today. No, that was just for the time period that they had to deal with the spill. So what happened with this is this is the company. So you can see it's fairly small, right? This is not a huge corporation. This is a very small company. They have these holding tanks that they hold materials in. And this, I believe it was this one right here, had a little bit of a leak in the bottom of it. Where these tanks were set up at, they had, for some unknown reason, they had gravel underneath these tanks, as opposed to having like a solid surface. Okay, so what happens when you spill liquid on gravel? It goes right through it. It does nothing to stop it, right? And so you see this little trickle down into the water right here. This is the way in which their chemical spill ended up in that water. So they didn't have a massive leak like this big tank wasn't like somebody ran into it, got a big hole, dumped all of its contents or anything like that. It had a tiny hole in the bottom on the inside of this container that was leaking. So obviously not visible. Nobody could see that. It's going down into the gravel, leaking off into here. Very small amounts initially, but went on for a long period of time, going straight down into the river here. Okay. This river, Freedom Industries, is up, or was at the time. The picture here, you can't see it up here because they've already wiped it off the face of the planet at this point, okay? But it was right here, okay? This is the water that it was leaking into. The water flows this direction, and right down here we have the water treatment facility for that entire community, okay? That water treatment facility was just like maybe a mile-ish down the road. And so when they had this chemical spill, they had, the material that was spilled was crude methocyclohexane methanol. I know, huge, horrible name. You're like, I don't even know what that is. It was mixed with propylene glycol phenyl ethers. Okay, so basically materials that are used for stripping metals, oils, stuff like that. And so initially they thought it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 gallons had leaked by the time they realized that there had been a leak. When they did further investigations, they figured out that it was really a little bit more in the neighborhood of, let's see, wait. No, they initially thought it was about 1,000 gallons, and it came out to be more like 10,000 gallons of this material.
How they realized it was leaking, like,
We're getting to that.
okay,
All right, so,
when all of a sudden the products were,
right, well, I mean, so you can think 10,000 gallons, that's a lot of material, right? They should have noticed. But like I said, it wasn't like a giant hole, like it all leaked out at once. This was a very small leak over a long period of time. Let me turn off the light here for a second so you see this picture a little bit better. This is the hole. Okay, so you see on the tape measure here, actually 2 holes. Okay, so this one is about a 1/2 inch. This one's more like 3/4 of an inch. Those are tiny holes in a giant tank, right? So you can imagine how long this material was leaking before they realized that there was a leak, right? It went on for quite some period of time. So when it happened, they initially, what happened was that at the water plant, they realized some of our tests are coming back off. There's something in the water that shouldn't be. And when they do that, they gotta like figure out what is it, and then, okay, where could this be coming from? They trace it back upstream to this company. They're like, you guys produce this. You probably have a leak. We need to figure out what's going on here. The problem was they didn't tell the community. You got materials that are used for stripping oil and stuff like that in your water. The water treatment center is, yes, it's intended to like clean the water and make it safe for you to drink and all that, but that's filtered for the things they know is in the water. It's not filtering for that material. So people are drinking this contaminated water. And this went on for 13 days before they told the public about what was going on, because they were worried about how the public would respond when they found out. And of course, I mean, if you're the person who's living in that community and you hear our water is contaminated, what are your initial thoughts?
How long has it been contaminated? What am I drinking?
What am I drinking? What is it gonna do to me? What's the risk here, right? And you're like, oh, I better stop drinking that water, right? So what's your thoughts if you find out it's been going on for 13 days?
I'll be pretty infuriated, yeah.
Right? You're gonna be pissed off. I've been drinking this stuff. Oh my God, am I gonna grow a 3rd arm or what is it that I've been drinking and what is it gonna do to me? Is this gonna cause me to die from cancer at some point in my future? What is it gonna do to me and my family? Because I mean, a lot of stuff you're exposed to for a very long period of time before you have any symptoms, so you may know absolutely nothing about it, right? So yeah, people freaked out and were infuriated when they found out, because they weren't told for so long. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of both the companies and public entities make, is that they don't say something immediately. They try to hide it, cover it up, get rid of it, instead of just saying, we have this problem, stop drinking the water. They had every ability to say, hey, something's in the water. We should put out a public notice saying, we need to investigate it further. We don't know exactly what's going on, but you shouldn't be drinking this water right now, right? So when they finally did, and they're trying to figure out what's there, clean it up and all that stuff, that $19 million is because every business that uses water now can't do their business because that water's contaminated. You can't put contaminated water in whatever product you're creating if you're a manufacturing facility, but also think about all the restaurants and things like that. Do you want to be served that or food that's been cooked with water like that? You want to be washing your hands in that before serving other people that, right? So it has a much bigger impact because it's in the water. If we spill the chemical and it's in the air, we can govern that a lot easier than we can the water. We don't have to shut everybody down, those that are within the area where they'd be exposed to that air, yes. But when it comes to water, and it's the main source of water that goes to everyone's home and everyone's business, huge impact when it comes to that.
As it comes back to more, you can't just say, oh, water and works, water and sprinkler system, it's in all their homes and their pipes.
It's literally touching every person's life in that community, right?
I wanna know whose smart idea was to put a chemical plant upriver of a large community.
It happens every day in probably just about every community
I
that
wonder-
you can imagine. Most likely, this was actually there before the water treatment center was built. That's what usually happens, is you have like, before cities develop these zoning rules and stuff like that, there's like this little thing over here and this little thing over there, and then like the city starts growing and all that kind of stuff, and they're like, oh, we have enough people now, we need to have a water treatment facility, and a great place for that is right along the river and this cheap piece of property, right? And they don't think about what's upstream from them because they're not supposed to be dumping that stuff in the water, right? But also there was outrage across the country for this because they were like, how does that even happen? Do we not have regulations to try to contain this stuff? Seems reasonable, right? We should have, but you would be wrong to think that because we don't. We do not have a federal requirement for above ground storage tanks. There are many states that have their own state requirement for it, but there is no federal requirement that we have above ground storage tanks that meet a certain criteria.
So you just throw on a patch of dirt and call it good.
You can do whatever you want when it's above ground.
So they don't have to have inspections on.
They did not, and that's exactly why they had that leak going on for so long, is those tanks had not been inspected for over 10 years. You put liquids in a metal tank, it's going to corrode at some point. Even if you have corrosion resistant coatings on the inside and things like that, at some point it's going to break down, right? They weren't doing any kind of inspection, okay? We do have an above ground requirement in that there must be containment. It doesn't break it down though in like somebody comes and checks on that for you. Generally, it's only found when there's a problem. And so these guys that where those tanks were at, this and the next picture here, these are some pictures of their containment. What do you notice in this picture right here?
Hole in it.
There's a hole in it. How does that contain things, right? And then you can see the surface down here is the gravel. We already talked about that, right? So typically when you think containment, you think watertight. It should hold the things that are in there. Yes. And that is what the standard requires. It's watertight and that it's large enough to hold at least one of the containers you have, plus in most states, it's going to say 25%. Okay. But if you have, what do they have, like 6 tanks there, 5 big ones and 3 little ones, and then 3 even smaller ones over here. The only requirement is that all of this be contained and be able to hold all of one of those, because we don't think far enough ahead to say, what about catastrophically? We have, let's say a tornado hits this and all of those tanks are somehow impacted. If that were to happen, they could have a containment that fully met the requirement, but still wouldn't contain all of that material, right? So they had not been inspecting the tanks, and so the tanks were corroded and had those tiny holes. Their containment that they had was not really in any ability able to contain the materials that they had, because it had that gravel surface, it had holes in it, they had pipes running over it. Like in the picture here, this tubing for stuff to be drained off outside of the area. Like every way possible, this is not literally going to contain anything, okay? And then also, so that this area doesn't fill up with water and make these metal containers rust more on the outside, they also put in drainage that led straight to that water source. Because, you know, you want the water to run off, right? So like somebody just didn't think this stuff through. And a lot of this is that stuff was built before standards in place, and people don't go back retroactively and think, oh, wait, well, that's not up to the standard. I should do something to fix this, especially in smaller companies. And you think in a smaller company like that, well, it's not a huge risk, but $19 million a day, that's a pretty big impact that they had on that community, right? And what it ended up, final total, $151 million cost to that facility. They went into bankruptcy because it was a small company and they could not afford $151 million of the cleanup and all that kind of stuff. 30-day prison sentences for 2 of the company officials on federal pollution charges, as well as fines and probation for 4 others. This part came from what little bit of a standard there was there that applied in that particular situation. Because they were supposed to have containment and it was not supposed to be able to leak into the water, if they were to have a spill and they were signing off on paperwork saying that they had that, that's where this came from. They were doing their inspection, pencil whipping the report. Yes, we have all of this stuff, and submitting their reports. And they weren't doing any kind of testing, even though the testing wasn't required. They can't fine you for not doing something that's a requirement. They can only fine you for what is legally required of you. So when situations like this happen, they didn't go to jail because they had a release. They went to jail because they were falsifying paperwork that said they had a containment that did not meet the standards that they were saying that it had. So when it comes to thinking about hazardous materials management employs a challenging blend of scientific, legal, technical, and management theories and practices. I think we probably tell you this in like every class. When you leave here, you're not going to be an expert in anything. You're going to be introduced to a whole lot of things in a lot of different areas, and you're going to know where to go looking for more information when you get out there. When you get out there, I mean, we have about 400 students in this program. You guys are going to not necessarily go into 400 different fields, but there will probably be hundreds of different things that you guys do. Every one of you are going to be dealing with different types of chemicals, different types of safety hazards, different types of standards are going to apply in the facilities that you go into. And there will be some commonalities, but all of you are going to have something that's unique to the place where you are at, right? And so we can't teach you about literally every single thing that you're ever going to experience when you get out there. But what we hope to teach you here is to keep your mind open. Look at how could this affect people? How could this affect the environment? And where do I need to find more information about this? Be willing to do your research, go and figure out more, find out more, become an expert in the things that affect you and the organizations that you go into. In the multidisciplinary effort, decisions are complex and crucial. And for some of you, there will be life and death situations related to those materials that you go to work for or that you go to work with. In my experience, one of the first companies that I worked with was a metal fabrication company, and we had hexavalent chromium, which I'm sure most of you guys probably be like, "Ooh, that sounds bad," but I don't know what it is, right? It's a material that can cause you to have cancer. They also had paints that had cyanide in them. And when I initially started working there, these materials, they left the curtains open on the paint booths because it was hot. And they didn't wear the respirators because they didn't like how it felt on their face. And so like when I first started going to work there, I walk around the first week trying to like kind of get the lay of the land, learn what's going on here. And I'm like, why is there a green cloud everywhere in this building? It's like somewhat foggy, and everything has this fine green powder on it because we painted things for the military. So military green, fine powder on everything. And I'm like, what is up with that? Didn't initially think, oh my God, this is hazardous, but like, why is it so dirty? Why is it like this? Okay. There were, so the paint that they used, they were these little, what they call paint liners. It was like a real thin plastic, rigid enough that you could set it up, but not like rigid, like a butter bowl or something like that, kind of somewhere in between. These little paint liners setting all over the building full of who knows what. Liquids of some sort, right? And I'm thinking, why don't I throw this stuff away? What is going on here? In some areas, there were these little paint liners with water or who knows what else, and cigarette butts in them. And I'm like, do we let people smoke inside the building? Is that okay? And I go out behind the building, and they have this tiny little shack behind the building where it's their hazardous waste storage. And the hazardous waste storage is literally just open drums sitting in there so that it doesn't fill up with rain, that they pour stuff in, but none of it's labeled. I don't know what's in any of it other than it's paint. Okay. And I'm thinking, oh dear God, what have I gotten myself into? Am I going to jail? This is, oh dear Lord. And my manager says, I want you to come up with an action plan by the end of the week, telling us what are you going to do for us in safety. And I'm like, okay, I got a lot to learn about what's going on here. Because first of all, I don't even know what all standards apply or what any of this stuff is. I'm like, end of the week might really be pushing it. I got a lot to learn here. Can we have 2 weeks? They give me 2 weeks. And then, okay, next, do you have a safety manual? You have something that tells me what it is you require of people. And they're like, maybe. We haven't had a safety person in a really long time, like 2 years. The last guy's stuff is all in a box in the attic. If you want to go dig through it, maybe there's something in there. And I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? Why did I not do more research before I accepted this job, right? And what I found out is, like, when I start doing a lot more research, is that we have the hexavalent chromium, which I had to look into and figure out what that was. We had barrels of sulfuric acid sitting like all over the place. We had chemicals that had cyanide in it all over the place, and we were filling that was the green powder. It was paint that had cyanide in it. It's literally all over our building.
Basically.
Yeah, right? And our guys in the paint booth who didn't wear their PPE because it was hot and uncomfortable were using methyl ethyl ketone to clean it off of their skin, their hair, their faces every day at the end of the day. And I'm like, dear Lord, have any one of you ever looked at an SDS? What's an SDS? And I'm like, hold on. So I had a whole big thing to start working on when I got started there with, like, what am I even dealing with in the first place? So when you guys get out there, there will be some companies like that where you're just like, dear Lord, what have I done? I can't, I got to start looking for another job immediately. There will be other companies where you're just like, wow, everything is laid out amazingly. If every company was like this, the world would have nothing to worry about. And there's a spectrum between those two, and you'll find everything in between, right? Do your research before you get a job. But also, when you get those jobs, do research. You need to know what you have. You need to be familiar with it and what it can do. You know, when I took that first job, I was straight out of college. I hadn't had an internship. I didn't know what I was doing. And I was the one and only safety person at that place. So there was nobody to go to and say, what do I even do? There was nobody to say, this is your to-do list for the week. I just had to figure it out. You are capable of figuring it out. I promise you, you are. And this class hopefully is going to help you have a good start on that. That you're not going to be an expert, but you're going to know where to start. You're going to know how to find the information on those SESs. You're going to be able to know where do you go, what websites, how do you find the information on the EPA's website? Where do you get started if you think there's a problem? And hopefully that will help you to make good, logical, sound decisions. I forgot where I put my clicker. There it is. When you get into whatever that job might be. Okay. When we think about the companies that we'll eventually be working for someday, there are this list of 9 assumptions that your book gives you. This is the basic things that you think should be reasonable for all companies, right? The goal of an organization is long-term viability and sustainability, right? They don't go into business so they can go bankrupt, do they? They're in business to make money, to make a product, to be awesome, do whatever the service is that they do, but mostly to make money and be successful, right? They're in business to deliver some type of service. A healthy community requires economic productivity and sustainable development for the benefit of all. A lot of times when you have a new company coming into a community, they are, one of their pushes to move into that new community is, you all need jobs, we're bringing jobs. We're here to help and support your community. The community is a viable and legitimate participant or stakeholder in the operation of the business. No, they don't get to tell you how to run your business, but they are affected by bad things that happen at your business. So they have a legitimate reason to know about what is being brought into their community and what they need to do about those hazards. When you get into watching the video about Bhopal, one of the things that really stands out near the end of that video is that if that were to happen in the United States today, it would have been over with real quick, and we wouldn't have had anywhere near that many people affected by it. In fact, the same company released the same chemical in the US within, I want to say, 2 years of Bhopal happening. and not a single person died from that one. Because there is a difference. We have a standard in the US that requires you share the information about what you have with the people who have a right to know, and the community around you has a right to know, right? So, in going back to that historical point, we didn't actually have that standard yet as a legal requirement at that point. But when Bhopal happened, obviously that caught the attention of the world, and the US was saying that never happened here. And they started making a standard at that point. It was not in effect yet when they had the release in the US. But obviously that company learned something from their release in India, and we're like, we need to put some prevention measures in place, okay? So we have the Community Right to Know Act that says you do have to tell people about the materials that they potentially could be exposed to, and what do they need to do. The biggest reason why so many people died in Bhopal is because they had no idea what to do. They weren't communicating with them about what they're being exposed to and what measures to take. And they'll tell you kind of near the end of that video that if they had stayed inside and put wet cloths over the windows and doors so that the air that was coming in would be trapped by that, because that material is drawn to water. So it would have kind of in a way been filtered out as it came into their homes. If they had blocked off all those air sources with wet towels, they wouldn't have died. In the US, if something like that happened, you would anticipate that you're getting phone calls, it's on the news, it's on social media and everything else saying, stay inside, turn your air conditioners off, close your windows and doors, do this and that, right? That didn't happen at that point. But we have a standard now that requires that we do that. And so we have to take into consideration those communities around us, because they do have that potential to be affected by, let me see if I can get out of this. I hate that thing. I always forget when I turn that on that if I touch the screen, it's going to mess it up. All right, so so we have to take into consideration the community around us and how we might impact them. The business community is in the best position to identify and implement new modes of operation that are environmentally compatible. Okay, we talked about at the beginning of this class that it started off being a forced requirement for companies to like not bury their waste in the backyard or dump it in the creek or whatever it might be, right? But we have moved on to, we don't need to force them anymore. Yes, we do still have standards in place for those of you that would not take that responsibility on their own. But for most companies, they understand that if I manage this stuff responsibly, it's going to be more financially profitable for us to do that. But also they're in a much better place to figure out what do I need to do with these materials than is the government to tell them what to do. And so we get a lot more improvement from voluntarily managing best practices and all of that kind of stuff than we ever did from forced regulations. Company goodwill is a major asset worthy of investment and protection. One of the first things that often happens when a company has a huge release or they impact a community is that, you know, all of a sudden they're the bad guy, regardless of their history. Now they are the bad guy. And depending on the particular situation and how much they try to hide it and all that kind of stuff, it can turn into a public nightmare for that company. Okay. Some of you guys are probably, actually most of y'all are probably too young to really remember the big oil spill that we had in the Gulf of Mexico. Like y'all are probably tiny kids if you were even alive at that point. But when we had the Deepwater Horizon, I always want to say Event Horizon. I'm like, no, that's not correct. Deepwater Horizon still in the Gulf of Mexico. BP is the company that was responsible when that happened. Okay. And it was a huge environmental disaster, but they also took steps that made them look terrible to the public when that happened. And because they did that, there were campaigns across the US to boycott BP. Okay. Don't go to BP gas stations, don't buy their gas, their oil or whatever, or any other products that they are in any way connected to. You guys see stuff like that on social media now. Like I want to say last semester, there was something about one of the beers. Not going to get into what happened there and all that, but there was some beer company that did something that everybody's like, we're not drinking that beer anymore, right? So people are real fast to jump on the like, kill that company bandwagon. Big companies like BP, they can survive that because they make so much money that it might have some impact, but it's not going to destroy them. Smaller companies, the kind of companies that the vast majority of you will work for, though they can't withstand that type of campaign against them. And it very well could be the difference between bankruptcy or not for them. So it is important that we think about the community, that we communicate with the community. We have goodwill toward the community and they have goodwill toward us because we have a relationship and work together and don't try to hide things. Company's future worth will be affected by current environmental decisions. The decisions that are made today are very much going to affect how profitable they are in the future. Action is preferable to reaction. It is always less expensive to prevent a release or disaster than it is to respond to one. And the objective is optimal environmental management, not minimal compliance. Just like with safety standards, and I guarantee you've heard this statement, like in every class you've been in, you've heard 100% compliance is not 100% safe, right? Standards, whether they be OSHA or EPA, are the absolute bare minimum that you can legally do and get away with it, right? It is not the best way to be safe. It is the absolute least you can legally do and not be fined for, right? So when it comes to both, I'm gonna throw this, in this class, we're talking about environmental and hazardous materials, but I'm gonna say across the board, when it comes to safety, environmental, any of that stuff, it is always better to go above and beyond than it is to just do the absolute least you can legally do and get away with it. So like other management functions, such as customer service, quality control, personal development, or personnel development, hazardous materials management is circumscribed by the various internal and external factors that define the organization. The goal of all management activities is the productive use of resources for the achievement of goals in support of an organization's mission, okay? If we were to say, with production, I want you guys to do the absolute least you can do, what would our management team think about that?
Wouldn't think very highly of it.
Right? That is not acceptable, right? If quality control was like, just, do the bare minimum. Get the least amount of product out the door that meets at least enough criteria that we can sell it to the public. What is management going to think about quality control?
Needs to be overhauled.
We need a new quality control manager. So why is it okay for us to say, let's do the absolute least we can do in safety and get away with it, right? It's not. You compare it to all other functions, it should be just as important. And I know a lot of people say safety should be number one. It's never going to be number one. It should be just as important as production and quality and all that other stuff, because they're all pieces of like a three-legged stool. Okay, you have a product, and your product is that three-legged stool. One leg is the production, one is quality, one is safety. Doesn't matter which one you take out, it's not going to be a great product if you take any one of those things away, right? It's not going to do what it's supposed to do. It's not going to be effective at its intended purpose. The same thing with safety. It should be on equal ground with production and quality control. So don't leave here thinking safety is number one. What I want to happen for this company is more important than what everybody else wants to happen. A lot of other people are going to look at it as the least important only because production and quality bring money in. Safety is never going to bring money in. But safety does save money. So it's also equally important that we're doing what we need to do so that our product is doing what it's supposed to be doing. What will an organization's hazardous materials management program reflect?
Identity, mission, mandates, and strategy.
Right, so when we think about production quality, we see very easily how it identifies the company, it meets with the identification of the company, its mission, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of times safety is its own little standalone island that really doesn't relate to all that other stuff. And that is not the way it should be. For your safety program to be the most effective that it can be, or your hazardous materials program, I kind of put them together because most often you're responsible for both, okay? Your safety and hazardous materials program to be as effective as it should be, it has to reflect all those same things. It has to take into consideration what is the identity of this company, its mission, its product, its purpose, and how can I support that to ensure that they are doing the best job that they can. Safety should be ensuring that that production is running at top speed and quality by ensuring that people are not getting hurt, that we have the ergonomic issues addressed so that people can be as productive as possible without causing injury to them. They should be as productive as possible without releasing materials into the environment. And that's how we support those organizations. And we need those as well. Those same, the mission and the purpose and all of that kind of stuff. We have to take that into consideration to make sure that the decisions we're making in hazardous materials or that we're recommending in hazardous materials and safety, that is supporting the overall mission and goal and identity and all of that of the organization that we're working with. So who is affected by the success or the failure of your hazardous materials management?
Individual citizens, business enterprises, public and industry organizations, and government agencies at every level.
Absolutely. Like the first thing that comes to mind is if we're not managing our hazardous materials, who's going to be affected?
Yeah.
The company, you're right. The company is the first thing that comes to mind. But yeah, all these other things that you just said, that, you know, not just the company is going to be affected, but the business, the public around us, the government agencies, and you might go like, wait a second. First of all, I don't care about the government and how they're affected, but how are they affected by that, right? Well, when things happen, like the freedom industries that we just talked about, there's always an outcry from the public when those things are on the news saying, how did this happen? How could you, meaning government officials, let this happen? You take our tax money, you have inspectors, how could this happen? You should be out there doing your job, you should have made sure we had a regulation, you should have been inspecting them and making sure or knowing when things happen. So they get hit pretty hard. Usually they're right there behind the company on who's getting beat up when something goes down, right? And we might not like hear so much that they're getting beat up, but it is going to affect them and potentially overall everybody else who is affected by those same regulations. Because, I mean, in all honesty, every single regulation that we have, it started out with something bad happened. And so we said that could never happen again and started building a regulation. So when something bad happens for our organization, it can potentially be that ignition source that starts the fire of change for government regulation for everybody else. So it has the potential to affect a lot more than just us, okay? What does the success or hazardous materials management depend on? It's going to depend on all of those relationships that we just talked about, all of those stakeholders, that your community is not necessarily involved in that they're in your business and they're doing your inspections and they know what's going on, where all your stuff is at and stuff like that, but they are involved in the communication process, that you're not hiding information from them, you're not hiding spills, things that could affect them, you're not hiding that stuff from them, you're thinking about ahead of time and trying to plan for and prevent things from occurring that would affect the rest of your community around you, okay? Poor environmental management may result in civil and criminal claims for what type of occurrences? What things could result? Don't give them all the answers. Make them work a little bit too. What things could result in civil or criminal claims? What do you think?
Code violations.
Code violations. You don't do something that there is an environmental standard for, you're gonna get fined for that, most likely. I mean, if you get caught, you're gonna get fined for it, right?
Civil
But
claims be from injury, illness, so on and so forth.
civil claims absolutely are going to be totally related to people outside of your facility being affected by the materials that you spill. So injuries, illnesses, or whatever that's caused by their exposure to those hazardous materials. What else? Who's inside your building?
Workers.
Your workers, right? I mean, like the main thing we talk about in this program is our workers, right? How are they gonna be affected?
They're gonna get sick, your company loses money.
Potentially they get sick or injured as well from their exposure to the hazard, and they have more potential for that than people outside of your facility, right? So they have the highest potential to be affected by injury or illness for those materials that they're exposed to. But also, many of these materials are things that they could potentially take home with them. It's materials like heavy metals and stuff like that. You have that on your clothing and you wear that clothing home, you can expose your entire family to those materials. If you were working in some type of like medical facility, exposure to the biological hazards in your workplace, you can take that home if you're not doing your job in a way that prevents your exposure to that. In the workplace, if you are exposed to some type of material that causes you long-term health effects, whether it be immediate or not, that's something that impacts you for the rest of your life, right? If it's something that causes liver damage, lung damage, something like that, it's going to affect you for the rest of the life. And provided you have, which most people do, some family members, some friends, somebody who cares about them, usually a lot more than just one, all of those people are also going to be affected by how you are being affected by the materials within your organization, right? And then also, of course, the environment as well can be impacted. And like we'll be talking about throughout the semester, sometimes in a very long-term way. There are these materials don't just disappear once they enter the environment. They can have disastrous effects that will last for generations. So even businesses that have never handled hazardous materials themselves may be affected, like banks, insurance companies, and other financial entities can be held liable for environmental cleanup and compliance. How are they going to be affected by that? How is it going to hurt your bank or your insurance company if you have a chemical release?
It's gonna cost money to get all that fixed.
Right. Most businesses are not so financially wealthy that they like used cash, bought their land, their building, all their products and all that kind of stuff, and that there's not some bank involved. Most businesses, there's a bank involved in that process. There's some kind of business loans, whether it was startup or improvements or whatever it might be. Most businesses are gonna have some kind of loans that whatever. If you go bankrupt, are they gonna get that money?
No.
No, and that's gonna hurt their business, right? And you might not care about that, especially at the point where you're having to deal with all the stuff that you're dealing with. But in thinking ahead, again, that impact spreads out way beyond just your own organization. When it comes to insurance companies, it costs a lot of money to respond to disasters, whether they be natural or man-made. Okay, it costs a lot of money to respond. Okay, insurance companies make their money by not having to respond. And so that's why when they come out and they look at your organization, they're looking at how much risk is involved in us covering you if something does go wrong. If there's higher chances of things going wrong, they're going to charge you more money because it's more likely to cost them money to cover, right?
They even get to the point where they're like, no, we're not gonna cover you at all.
Yes, that absolutely does happen. That has been an issue with, especially some like in the coastal areas because of all the hurricanes and stuff like that, that there are some insurance companies that they're just like, we're not going there because the risk is too great. There were insurance companies that went bankrupt when Katrina happened because that was way bigger impact than anybody foresaw happening.
I know one guy and he lost, just him alone, like he lost like $300,000 worth of, he's a trucker and then did like materials and equipment. And so, and he had a local small insurance company covering him, and a lot of people did. think of the strain on like say there's one guy who's did big insurance agent and started his own little small company and then something like that happened.
Mhm. It can make you bankrupt and everybody else that was connected to you in any way. It is absolutely a domino effect, and it can really suck for the community around you and everybody that had anything to do with you if something goes wrong. So not to say that all hazardous materials are high risk, but again, the whole big point of this whole chapter is know what you're working with, know what you're dealing with, and learn everything you can about those so that you can appropriately manage the risk that is involved. Sound hazardous materials management has moved beyond the end of the pipe afterthought of previous decades and is now a requirement for long-term business survival. So when it said that term end of the pipe, that's practice of ignoring environmental impacts of a product's waste until the waste reaches literally the end of the pipe, till it's dumped out wherever it goes. And like we talked about, that is the aspect of, or the perspective that was in place before we had standards and regulations. It was just kind of like, oh, this is a byproduct of our operations. We don't need this, dump it in the river, dump it out behind the building, bury those barrels or whatever. And it never occurred to people that there would be a problem from those materials until there was a problem, okay? So how does the current practice for environmental management avoid that? What do we do now?
A lot stricter guidelines, like chemical containment, secondary containment, stuff like that.
Right, we have guidelines, regulations, standards that say you should do these things to prevent that. Do we start out operations in today's day and time and not think about where's the waste gonna go? No, because we can't. If you are going to bring hazardous materials into your facility, you have to have an EPA identification number, and you have to fill out all kinds of paperwork. You have to get permits and stuff like that to handle those materials and house them in your facility. And to do that, you have to explain, what are you gonna do with it? So we're kind of forced into where we should have been in the first place. What are we gonna do with this stuff when we're done? Because there's always gonna be some leftover. There's always gonna be some amount of spills or waste, or if nothing else, at least the containers that the materials came in. Those are still, they have hazardous materials residue in them. So they have, you can't, you know, if you get a barrel and it has sulfuric acid, or it has, you know, anything, and what is the hydrofluorocarbons, you know, whatever it might be. I was trying to think of one of the words. There's a chemical that we used to use that literally it can melt your bones, and water doesn't wash it off. And I'm like, I can't think of what the name of that chemical was. I know it started with an F. But you get a barrel full of that stuff. You use it in your product. When you're done, that barrel still has some in it, right? Just like you have a container, you drink all the milk out of your milk jug at home, it still has a little in the bottom, right? You throw it away, you never give it another thought. If you have a material that literally melts through your skin and bones and water does nothing to stop it, is it okay to throw that in the garbage?
Probably not.
Definitely not. You don't want to put that in the trash and put it out into the environment. But you know, it's soak through to China. No. As far as I know, we don't have any materials that if you drip it on the ground, it's going to continue going till it comes out the other side of the earth. Yes, but we're always making new things, right? Science is scary, but exciting. So we have changed from this just thinking about our product and what we're going to do with our product, thinking about the entire life cycle. What do we do with whatever's left over, the waste, the spills, the residues, and all of that kind of stuff. So we no longer are in this place where we can just be like, we'll figure it out eventually. We can't. I think at least one or two of you was in the systems class where I was talking about yesterday that when I went to work for one company, they had all of this foam that was considered a hazardous material because of what the foam was made out of. It was an insulating product that was used inside of containers that we made. And when I first started working there, they had a warehouse that was just literally packed floor to ceiling with this stuff. Huge amount of wasted space where we were doing nothing because it was full of boxes of this material. And I'm like, what is all that? I'm like, oh, it's some foam that we got to figure out how we're going to get rid of. That's on your to-do list too. And I'm like, who starts doing, like, so I guess the answer to that question I just asked you, in today's day and age, yes, apparently some companies do that. Because it wasn't like a hazardous, it was hazardous for disposal, but it wasn't classified as a hazardous material when we're receiving it. But it's something you can't just throw away in the landfill. So there are some areas where things are complicated, and sometimes people don't think about what's gonna happen with these materials, and that becomes part of your job, is how do we get rid of all the stuff that we've gotta get rid of. I'm gonna stop right there, because I'm not gonna get through this in 5 minutes, so. We will pick up where we left off here on Tuesday. If you haven't read chapter 1, please do. I think we'll probably finish it on Tuesday. Maybe, it might be going Thursday.